Chapter 4. What with Lucy gone and all, this is going to be a crazy week for me, Tony. Frank told the twins early Monday morning. And I'm sorry to say that. Supervising interns isn't terribly high on the priority list. You'll have some assignments, but I'm afraid you'll be on your own a lot too. So plan to do a lot of sightseeing, or whatever it is that American teenagers do in London. Jessica grinned, thinking this way she'd finally have time to hit the stores. Will it be Harrods or Bond Street? Elizabeth, though, had a thoughtful look on her face. Tony, Elizabeth began, you don't mind if I spend some of that extra time tracking down some stories on my own, do you? Jessica rolled her eyes. It was just like her narg of a sister to want to spend the week writing. Well, she was still mad at Elizabeth for criticizing Robert, and she wasn't going to waste a moment worrying about whether Elizabeth was having fun this week. Still thinking about that Pulitzer, Liz? Tony replied. Go right ahead. Like reporters who take the initiative. Just don't get in over your head. Leave the breaking news to the professionals. Well, I guess that's singular. Now, he said, referring to Lucy's absence. Do you think Lucy is gone for good, Tony? Elizabeth asked, taking his cue. I'm afraid so, Elizabeth, Tony answered. And I'm also afraid you're looking at the London Journal's new crime desk editor. Congratulations, Jessica said, happy for Tony's success but sorry that it meant she wouldn't be seeing any more of the grouchy but glamorous Friday. That's more exciting than covering tea parties for the society desk. I've wanted this job all my life, Tony admitted, though I hate the idea that I'm here only because Lucy resigned. And I guess this isn't going to make her any more likely to want to make up with you, Jessica said sympathetically. Tony's face fell. Jessica had known from the start that Tony was in love with Lucy, even though they spent most of their time together bickering, arguing, and just plain yelling at each other. Lucy had accused Tony of sensationalizing the princess story in order to get the crime desk job for himself. Now that Tony had the position, Jessica reflected, their chances for a reconciliation were zilch. It's too bad about Lucy, Elizabeth said. She seemed difficult to get to. No, but she's a first-rate journalist. You're right on both counts, Tony agreed. I'm the first to admit that. Lucy's really the best man for the crime desk job. It'll be tough to fill her court shoes. Jessica stared at him. Huh. You know, court shoes. Tony laughed. High-heeled pumps in American. Jessica sighed. Why can't the English speak English like regular people? Because regular people are naffs and narcs, Elizabeth said, reminding Jessica that she'd been dropping a few Briticisms herself. Speaking of words, Tony said, laughing, I've got an assignment I want you both to work on this morning. Jessica's visions of shopping dimmed. In the last week you two have been assigned a number of disparate topics, everything but the kitchen sink, in fact. Today we'll remedy that deficiency. That sounds ominous, Elizabeth said. We're calling this the case of the flying sink, Tony continued. It seems that a university student was walking down Tottenham Court Road when he was hit on the head by a kitchen sink that came soaring through the air. The twins groaned in unison. Another Bumpo story, they exclaimed. Sergeant Bumpo was the bungling Scotland Yard detective who always handled the most ridiculous cases. I'd rather be shopping, Jessica thought ruefully. Well, I guess we'd better catch up with Bumpo, Elizabeth said with a sigh. After Tony dismissed the twins, Jessica knew that Elizabeth was itching to show off her journalistic skills on the case of the werewolf murders. How could calm, reasonable Elizabeth have turned into such a basket case that she actually believes in werewolves? Jessica glanced up and saw the answer to her question. Luke. He had somehow convinced Elizabeth that a werewolf could be responsible for the deaths of Joy and the other victims. Luke smiled warmly at Elizabeth. Would you like to go to the cinema with me tonight, Liz? The Howling is playing at the Paradiso. That would be great, Elizabeth replied, smiling and actually sounding pleased at an invitation to watch a werewolf movie. Jessica shook her head. The old Elizabeth thought horror movies were childish. Then Jessica remembered a snatch of an old Warren Zevon song and began singing tunelessly. Ow! Werewolves of London. Ow! Jessica! Elizabeth protested. Jessica folded her arms in front of her. I can't believe this. You two are taking this goofy werewolf stuff too seriously. Don't make light of werewolves, Jessica, Luke said in a quiet voice. They're very serious business. Luke leaned over to kiss Elizabeth on the forehead. I'll come by your doormat. 8, he said, then crossed the room and disappeared through the door, leaving Jessica shaking her head in disgust. So, Sergeant Bumpo, have you determined where the flying sink came from? Elizabeth asked the short, round detective, trying to keep the impatience out of her voice. Certainly. It was dropped from the window of the 6th-floor flat. Jessica grimaced. Why would anyone try to kill a college student by dropping a kitchen sink on his head? I have conducted an intensive investigation on that very point, Bumpo said, in an important-sounding voice. Fingerprints, interviews with witnesses, analysis of the forensic evidence. And what did you discover? Elizabeth interrupted. Bumpo loved using every investigative technique known to criminal science, and he loved talking about them even more. Usually Elizabeth found him amusing, but today she was in a hurry to go question Lady Pembroke if she could find an excuse to get away from Jessica. After serious examination of the evidence, Bumpo said, I've determined that the young fellow was hit entirely by accident. It seems a carpenter in the 6th-floor flat was installing a new wash basin. The old one was rather heavy to tote down the stairs, and the lift wasn't working, so he dropped it out the window instead. Unfortunately, he failed to notice the poor chap walking past below. So what's the condition of the victim? Elizabeth asked. The fellow's doing splendidly, conscious and in good spirits, the detective replied. He's in hospital, of course, but it's only a slight concussion. Luckily, he's a jolly strapping youth university football player, you know. Jessica brightened. Football player? Bumpo wiped a hand across the top of his head, as if to assure himself that his few wisps of hair still shielded his rather large bald spot. I suppose that's soccer to you Americans, isn't it? Suddenly, Elizabeth knew how to get away from her sister. In love or not, Jessica never passed up a chance to meet a good-looking college boy. Jessica, Elizabeth said, I think it's very important that we interview the victim. Would you mind heading over to the hospital to question him? I'll stay here and finish up with Sergeant Bumpo. Then I'm meeting Renee for lunch. I'll see you at the Journal later this afternoon, and we'll write up the story. Jessica smiled gratefully, ignoring the fact that she was angry with Elizabeth. I think you're absolutely right, she said. I'll get over to the hospital right away. After Jessica was gone, Elizabeth hurried through the rest of her discussion with Sergeant Bumpo and then took a taxi to the Pembroke's fashionable Eaton Square home, Pembroke Green. Ciao for now to the case of the flying sink, she thought as she sank back into the cushy seat of the distinctive black Austin, London Standard taxi. As exciting as it was to work for a real big city newspaper, Elizabeth had been bitterly disappointed by the types of articles she was assigned to write. She knew it was unrealistic to expect to cover a major story. She was just a high school intern. But she was sure she could do it. Maybe her private investigation of the werewolf murders would give her the chance. As London flew past her window, Elizabeth imagined her byline on a page 1. Journal exclusive. Murder suspect apprehended. She smiled at the familiar daydream. Then she gave a long sigh and forced herself to concentrate on her upcoming interview with Lady Pembroke. What do the Pembrokes have to hide? She asked under her breath. Lady Pembroke might not know about the journalist's cover-up of the murders, but she would certainly remember the scandal that had rocked the family name 15 or 20 years earlier. Whether she would tell Elizabeth, or rather Jessica, was another question entirely. Unclasping her hair from its neat ponytail and stuffing the barrette into her purse, Elizabeth began her transformation into Jessica, who usually wore her hair down. Then she pulled out a lipstick and applied it liberally. Elizabeth seldom wore makeup, but Jessica wouldn't think of walking into the Pembroke's townhouse without it. A few minutes later, Jessica sat in a sumptuously furnished parlor with Lady Pembroke. A butler hovered nearby, waiting to refill their teacups and glaring suspiciously at Elizabeth. Why didn't I put more thought into my clothes today? She silently chastised herself, looking down at her simple navy skirt and white blouse. Lady Pembroke, of course, was dressed impeccably, in a cream-colored silk suit and a strand of pearls. Not surprising, considering this was a woman who owned at least one mink coat that was worth roughly as much as a 4-year college education in the States. Thanks for seeing me on the spur of the moment like this, Lady Pembroke, she said with exactly the right amount of Jessica's bounce in her voice. I was in the neighborhood and had just a few questions to go over with you about your missing mink coat. Lady Pembroke looked down her long thin nose. I thought we had exhausted the topic when you and that dreadful Sergeant Bumpo interviewed me last week, she said. But go ahead if you must, especially if it will help recover my mink. As I understand it, Elizabeth said carefully, you checked your mink while you were having tea at Brown's. When you went to claim it afterward, you were given a chinchilla instead. A simply wretched chinchilla, Lady Pembroke emphasized. Elizabeth stifled an urge to roll her eyes. Instead she pretended to write in her reporter's notebook. I suppose you were having tea with your husband, Lord Pembroke. No, I was not, Lady Pembroke replied, narrowing her eyes. Then you were alone. Miss Wakefield, a woman of breeding, never dines alone in public. I was with friends, of course, as I said in my statement to the detective, but I failed to see what difference it makes who my companions were. Elizabeth smiled, hoping she looked friendlier than she felt. I was just wondering if there were any other witnesses to the crime. But you're right. I can get that information from Sergeant Bumpo's report, so I won't waste any more of your time on it. Lady Pembroke sniffed. See that you don't, but I am gratified that somebody at the newspaper is taking this case seriously. My husband certainly isn't. And that horrible little Scotland Yard detective seemed to think the disappearance of my mink was a simple misunderstanding. I for one am convinced that a crime has taken place. I'm sure you're right, Lady Pembroke, Elizabeth agreed. Then she decided to press her advantage. You know, a thorough newspaper article has a way of bringing a crime like this out into the open. The more information I have, the easier it will be for the police to recover your mink. For instance, does anyone have a reason to hold a grudge against you or your family? Even an incident that took place a very long time ago, like 20 years ago, could cause somebody to perpetrate a crime like this for revenge. Lady Pembroke's perfectly manicured fingers gripped her teacup tighter, her long pink fingernails clinking against the fine bone china. When she stood up, her eyes were flashing, and Elizabeth realized she had gone too far. I have no idea what you are alluding to, Lady Pembroke said in a furious but perfectly controlled voice. I understand that my son thinks quite highly of you, but I find you to be a boorish, ill-bred young woman. This interview is over. So this is the newsroom, Emily said, coming up behind Jessica, who sat at a computer on Monday afternoon, typing the day's Bumpo article with 2 fingers. Are you ready to go out for tea? Jessica grimaced. Not until I finish this stupid story for the evening edition. Another exploding aubergine? Or was it a turnip this time? Very funny, Jessica said. But this happens to be an important article. A college student was injured in a major accident this morning. Was water-related. Oh, really?
A boating accident?
That does sound important. Let me see. Jessica tried to block Emily's view of the computer screen, but she was too slow. Emily burst out laughing. A kitchen sink fell on his head? I've heard of it. Raining cats and dogs, but never plumbing fixtures. Jessica laughed in spite of herself. What a waste of a perfectly good morning. The guy who got clobbered by it wasn't even good-looking, tons of acne and no neck. Speaking of good-looking, wasn't Elizabeth having lunch with Renee today? How did that go? Jessica raised her eyebrows. Apparently it's going well. My deadbeat sister hasn't come back. That's why I'm stuck writing this story. Elizabeth hasn't returned? Do you suppose she finally gave in and decided that she loves Renee after all? A few weeks ago I'd have said you were crazy, but Elizabeth has really gone off the deep end since she's been here. She shook her head. Nobody back home would believe it if they heard I was sitting in a stuffy newspaper office, writing an article that Elizabeth promised to do, while she's out with a great-looking French guy. It's as if she's turned into me. What's so unusual about Elizabeth having a date? Emily asked. I thought she had a rather handsome boyfriend at home. That's just the point. She's usually boringly loyal to Todd. If she can forget all about him to have a fling with Luke, maybe she'd go out with Renee, too. I never thought I'd say this about my sister, but I've got to hand it to her juggling 3 boys at once. As I said, she's sounding more and more like me. Are you still mad at her for what she said yesterday? I guess I'll get over it, Jessica said. I wish she'd give Robert a chance. But she really thinks she's looking out for me. Liz can be kind of a mother. Hen. She's 4 minutes older than I am, and she thinks that gives her the right to boss me around. The phone rang. Jessica picked it up to hear Robert's voice inviting her to dinner at Pembroke Green that night with him and his mother. My father won't be present, of course, Robert told her. He's still at the manor house taking care of some business, but I was hoping to bring you and Mother together to help you two become reacquainted. From what Mother said, I take it your interview with her at the house today was less than successful. Interview? What interview? You know, the one this morning about her missing mink coat. She told me you came by to follow up on it for your newspaper story. Jessica's eyes widened as realization swept over her. Elizabeth went to Pembroke Green today disguised as me. Jessica's forgiveness faded, replaced by rage. Oh, she said in a quiet, strained voice. That interview. She seems rather upset with you, in fact, Robert continued. I'm sure it was all a misunderstanding. She said you were asking a lot of personal questions, but I know you were just doing your job. Don't worry too much about it. Jessica, Mother can be rather difficult to get along with, but I'd like to give the two of you a chance to become friends. How about if I pick you up around 6 o'clock? That would be fine, Robert. Jessica hung up the phone and sat quietly, her hand still clenching the receiver. What is it, Jess? Emily asked. You look upset. She's done it now, Jessica said in a barely controlled voice. She's convinced that Robert's no good. She'll go to any lengths to find dirt on him. But this time she's gone too far. And she's going to pay for it. Jessica, who are you talking about? Emily asked. What happened? I think I'm finally going to have a major story to report on for the Journal, Jessica announced. American teenager murders twin sister. My visit to Pembroke Green was disastrous, Elizabeth confided to Renee as they strolled through Regent's Park after lunch Monday. Lady Pembroke practically had me thrown out of the house. I'm sure she hates me. Except that she thinks it is Jessica she hates, the French boy supplied. That's right. And Jessica will be furious when she finds out. Renee chuckled. Can you blame her? On one hand, I hope I didn't wreck Jessica's relationship with Robert's family. But on the other hand, anything that pushes Jessica away from the Pembrokes can't be all that bad. I'm still convinced that there's something sinister going on with that family. Did you learn anything else of importance from Lady Pembroke? Not really, Elizabeth said, except that she practically sneers every time she mentions her husband's name. There's no love lost between those two. No, I didn't notice it over the weekend, but now that I think about it, they hardly said a word to each other the whole time I was at Pembroke Manor. A loveless marriage? Could that, how do you say, shed some light on the other avenues you are investigating? I don't know. I keep wondering about the big scandal. Apparently something awful happened nearly 20 years ago that caused the Pembroke name to be dragged through the mud. Maybe whatever it was turned Lord and Lady Pembroke against each other. Of course, she admitted. That's pure speculation. Perhaps Jessica has heard something about this scandal in the time she has spent with the Pembrokes. Elizabeth shook her head. I doubt they would bring up a topic that apparently caused them so much embarrassment, and I'm certainly not going to mention it to her. She wouldn't believe anything bad about the Pembrokes anyway. She thinks they're perfect. Whatever Jessica says, I believe that Lord Pembroke knows more than he's saying about the murders of Joy Singleton and Cameron Neville. It's possible that he's the murderer himself, or that Robert or Lady Pembroke is. From what you've said of the lady, it sounds as if she could freeze her victims to death with a single glance. But seriously, Elizabeth, I am worried about you. This investigation is beginning to sound dangerous. Elizabeth was touched by his concern, but she thought it was unwarranted. Don't worry about me, Renee. I'm perfectly safe. Elizabeth, you have seen 2 mutilated bodies, 3 if you include the small terrier. You've been warned to cease your inquiries into the deaths by a man whom you admit could be the murderer, a wealthy, powerful man who's accustomed to having his every wish obeyed. How can you say you are in no danger? Renee, I was at Pembroke Manor Saturday night too, but it was Jessica's room. The murderer chose and Joy who was killed. Nobody has threatened my safety. Don't think. She stopped when she noticed Renee looking at her curiously. What's that silver pendant you're clutching so tightly, Liz? He asked. On the chain around your neck. Elizabeth blushed and let go of the necklace. It's, a pentagram. A pentagram? Isn't that a talisman for use against werewolves? He inspected the pendant. Elizabeth, where did you get this? Elizabeth sighed. From Luke, she said, watching Renee's face. Renee grimaced. Not Luke again. Please, Renee. Don't be upset. Renee forced a smile. I am trying not to be, he said. But this is an odd gift from a beau, is it not? Elizabeth took a deep breath and looked him straight in the eye. I wasn't going to tell you, Renee, because it sounds so crazy, but Luke and I believe the murderer could be a werewolf. Now you are jesting with me. No, I'm not. Look at the evidence, Renee. The bodies were found with their throats ripped out. That doesn't sound like your normal everyday serial killer. And I found some animal fur at the scene of Joy's murder. Even if werewolves did exist, I thought they hunted only when the moon was full, Renee objected. That's not true, Elizabeth said. Luke has been studying werewolves for years. He says they can change their shape anytime they want to, though. They're at their greatest strength under the full moon. Renee just shook his head. Elizabeth blushed again, realizing how far-fetched the theory sounded. I see what you mean, she said haltingly. Our evidence is pretty sketchy, and from your perspective the idea must sound irrational. Completely, Renee said. Certainly the murders were grisly, but humans have been known to kill in horrible ways, and the animal hair could have come from a family pet or perhaps from one of Lady Pembroke's furs. Elizabeth sighed, knowing that Renee was right. Luke, with his love of romantic horror fiction and his lifelong interest in werewolf lore, had wanted the murderer to be a werewolf, so he had convinced himself that it was true. And Elizabeth, caught up in the excitement of falling in love, and of having a real mystery to solve, had gone right along with him. She glanced at Renee walking beside her. He was practical, reasonable, and totally objective, so different from romantic, sensitive Luke. She was in love with Luke, but she resolved to be more like Renee. She would never find out what the Pembrokes were hiding if she kept allowing herself to be carried away by fantasies. Okay, she admitted. There are no werewolves. And for the first time in days she truly believed it. Chapter 5. Jessica was standing with her back to the door when Elizabeth walked into the girls' room at his Monday evening. Do you think this dress makes me look fat? Jessica chirped, modeling an elegant white sheath for Lena and Portia. Of course Elizabeth knew Jessica realized the dress looked stunning on her. Jessica turned, posing for her friends. Then she caught sight of Elizabeth in the doorway, and her expression turned to poison. The dress looks terrific, Elizabeth said, ignoring the thunderclouds in Jessica's eyes. And that gold jewelry is perfect with it. Are you going somewhere special tonight? When I want your opinion, I'll ask for it, Jessica said acidly. But don't hold your breath. Lena and Portia glanced hesitantly from twin to twin, looked at each other, and silently left the room. Elizabeth took a deep breath. Jessica, how could you do such a thing? Jessica stormed. I can't believe you would pretend to be me just so you could spy on my boyfriend and turn his mother against me. It wasn't like that, Jessica, I swear. I wasn't trying to turn Lady Pembroke against you. I just needed some information. Right. And now you're going to tell me it was all in the name of journalistic integrity. Darn you, Liz. You've hated my relationship with Robert from the start. You just want me to break up with him. What's the problem? Are you jealous that I'm dating a nobleman and you're not? Stringing along 3 guys isn't enough for you, is that it? Now you want Robert too. Elizabeth was mortified that Jessica could have mistaken her motives so badly. Jessica, you know that's not true. Don't tell me what I know. One thing's for sure, I don't know you anymore. The sister I know wouldn't pretend to be me and bother my boyfriend's mother with a lot of rude questions. What gives you the right to pry into Robert's life? Jessica, you've got to believe me. I'm not investigating Robert. This has nothing to do with your relationship with him. A killer is on the loose. My investigation of why Lord Pembroke is covering up the murder stories in the newspaper may lead to the murderer. Jessica's voice was laden with sarcasm. Oh, I remember. That's the same investigation where you discovered a ferocious werewolf stalking the streets of London, hunting its next victim. England will certainly sleep easier tonight knowing you and Luke the Kook are on the job. Face it, Liz, you two are out of control. Covering murders is way out of your league. Maybe you should stick to homicidal kitchen sinks. Jessica, Elizabeth said, trying to keep her voice even, I'm sorry I upset Robert's mother. But the Pembrokes are hiding something important about the murders. The Pembrokes have nothing to do with the deaths, and you don't have a shred of evidence that proves otherwise. Well, I'm not going to take the rap for your obnoxious questions. How do you think Lady Pembroke will respond when she hears who really interviewed her this morning? Elizabeth grabbed Jessica by the shoulders and stared at her wildly. Please, Jessica, she said aghast. You absolutely cannot tell the Pembrokes the truth about the interview today. If you do, you'll tip off Lord Pembroke that I'm investigating him, and you'll blow any chance I have of discovering who the murderer is. To Elizabeth's surprise, her sister burst into tears. You've ruined everything, she screamed. I love Robert. I wanted so badly to fit in with his family, but now his mother hates me. The worst part about it is that I can't even tell her it was you at Pembroke Green today. If I do, she'll think I come from a family of complete flakes. Why couldn't you mind your own business for a change? I never want to speak to you again. Jessica ran out of the room, slamming the door behind her. Elizabeth sighed. But she couldn't spend time worrying about Jessica's anger. The important thing right now was to find the murderer, even if it meant rattling any skeletons that hid in the Pembroke closet. It wasn't me. Jessica wanted to scream at dinner Monday night. I didn't ask you all those obnoxious questions. It was my evil twin Elizabeth. Instead, she took another bite of the perfectly prepared pheasant and wished she could savor the sumptuous meal. Unfortunately, under Lady Pembroke's icy glare, everything she ate tasted like sawdust. So Jessica, Lady Pembroke began in a cold, hard voice, are you enjoying your work as a reporter? Your interview style is rather unsubtle. I had heard that Americans prize directness. In England we favor a more moderate approach. Please, Mother, Robert interjected. It's a reporter's business to ask a lot of questions. Jessica smiled gratefully at him, but Lady Pembroke raised her eyebrows, obviously unimpressed. It's hard to defend myself when I don't know what I'm defending, Jessica thought. Unfortunately, she still wasn't sure exactly what Elizabeth had asked that morning. Maybe she could get Lady Pembroke to tell her. I am so sorry if some of my questions were too personal, Jessica said, hating herself for taking the blame for Elizabeth's blundering. But I'm still very new at this reporting thing, and I was feeling nervous interviewing someone of your, stature. Maybe you could help me improve my skills. Can you tell me just which questions were, inappropriate? Lady Pembroke sniffed, as if the unfortunate questions had left an odor that still wafted through the halls of Pembroke Green. All of your questions were inappropriate, young lady. Mother, Robert protested. In particular, Lady Pembroke amended quickly, with a glance in Robert's direction. The question about Pembroke family history was in exceedingly poor taste, and the identity of my dining companion was entirely irrelevant to my stolen mink. Jessica was mystified. Family history? Dining companion? She couldn't believe her sister had seen fit to conduct a background check on one of the oldest, most respected families in England, all because she was afraid Robert wasn't good enough to date Jessica. Who did Elizabeth think she was? The Pembrokes were related to the royal family. What would Elizabeth look for next? Character references? Robert took Jessica's hand in his mother's and squeezed them both heartily. It's marvelous that you two have managed to clear the air so quickly and can now go on to become friends, he said hopefully. Lady Pembroke made a noise that sounded like humph. She hates me, Jessica told herself. Elizabeth has destroyed my chances of ever fitting in with Robert's family. I apologize for my mother, Robert said later, as he escorted Jessica outside to his silver Jaguar convertible for the drive back to his. But don't worry. In time, she'll come to love you as much as I do. I wouldn't bet on it, Jessica said glumly. Elise, I've made her so mad that she'll never forgive me. That isn't true, Robert insisted, gently brushing a stray lock of golden hair out of her eyes. But even if it were, it wouldn't matter. I don't need my mother's permission to be in love with you. Robert was definitely the most wonderful boy in the whole world. You said Tony Frank wants you to adopt a relaxed attitude toward the journal this week, he said. Why don't you take Wednesday off and spend it with me? We'll take the Jag and go for a drive in the country with the top Down if the weather holds. Have you been to Stonehenge yet? Jessica raised her eyebrows. Isn't it just a bunch of old rocks? Oh no, Robert explained, staring intently into her eyes. It's much more than that. It's you and me, Jessica, all alone in the countryside with nothing around us but lonely fields and the open road. Robert's hand slid to Jessica's back. When his full warm lips met hers, she felt tremors radiating through her whole body. After they kissed, Robert held her at arm's length. So, do we have a date? He asked. Do you want to go to Stonehenge with me on Wednesday? Jessica smiled dreamily. I'm dying to. Humans are our prey, said a gnarled, unshaven man. The werewolves, all in human form, were slowly circling Karen White, the television reporter. A raven-haired woman panted at the reporter. Her face twisted into a hungry "Dulciler. She's ours now." Elizabeth jumped as something hairy touched her arm. Then she realized it was only the sheepskin cuff of Luke's jacket, as he reached for a handful of popcorn. Normally, horror movies left Elizabeth unaffected. She would be too busy analyzing the plot deficiencies to be terrified by the special effects. But that Monday night at the Paradiso, the howling didn't seem so far-fetched. Karen had been sent to a colony in the woods to recover from an attack by a serial killer. But the other patients there were werewolves, and their plan was to infiltrate society. For an instant, Elizabeth had a mental image of Pembroke Manor as the colony. Robert Pembroke glided toward her, his fangs dripping with blood. But it wasn't Elizabeth he was approaching. The blondes had switched beds. It was Jessica, and she smiled serenely and offered him her throat. Elizabeth shook her head to clear the daydream and tried to concentrate instead on the more ridiculous elements of the film's plot. This is a stupid movie, she told herself. There's no such thing as werewolves. But other images kept crowding into her brain. She saw Dr. Neville's body lying on floral carpeting in a pool of blood, murdered as if by a wild beast. She saw the jewels sparkling in the moonlight from Poo-Poo's crimson-stained dog collar. She saw Luke bending over a low shrub covered with hooded flowers, wolfsbane, he'd said, which blooms only when the werewolf is stalking its prey. She thought of the Pembroke sheep mutilated. Then Elizabeth remembered the scrap of fur caught in the doorframe and the full moon streaming through the casement window of Joy's bedroom at Pembroke Manor. Beware the full moon. Last, Elizabeth saw Joy's body, lying still and cold as the blood from the gash in her throat dripped slowly into a puddle on the floor beneath the bed. The bed that was supposed to have been Jessica's. We should never try to deny the beast, the animal in us, the doctor in the howling had advised. We all have an animal side, Luke had said. Karen White had an animal side. She returned from the colony, but she had been bitten and so was destined to become an animal herself. Elizabeth watched, mesmerized, while Karen transformed into a wolf while anchoring the evening news. The reporter's body began to tremble. Now I'm going to show you something to make you believe, she said to the camera. She rose painfully from her seat and arched her neck, her eyes gleaming with an eerie light. Her anguished cry turned into a howl as hair began to transform her face and neck. Her teeth elongated into fangs, but a very human tear spilled from the corner of one. By the time Karen's friend shot her mercifully with a silver bullet in the heart, Elizabeth's doubts about werewolves were also laid to rest. She clutched her pentagram pendant as if it were a security blanket. Werewolves do exist, she whispered under her breath, and one of them is stalking its prey in London. Chapter 6. The Slaughtered Lamb, Elizabeth said, looking across her coffee cup at Luke, as they sat in a pub after the movie Monday night. Last week I thought it was a quaint name for a pub. She shuddered. Now I'm not so sure after what happened Saturday night to the sheep at Pembroke Manor. Luke shook his head sadly. We can't dwell on that, Elizabeth. We must concentrate on proving that the Pembrokes are guilty. But guilty of what? Elizabeth asked. We still don't know who the murderer is. All we know for sure is that Lord Pembroke is hiding something. He's hiding the fact that one of the Pembrokes is a murderer, Luke said. And a werewolf. Elizabeth gripped the pentagram pendant that hung around her neck. You've finally convinced me about the murderer being a werewolf. There isn't any other explanation that fits the evidence we've found. But we can't prove that one of the Pembrokes is the murderer. Then we must get the proof, Luke said quietly. And we must do it quickly. Lord Pembroke is already suspicious. Elizabeth nodded. He's the key to all of this. But Luke, he hates me. He'll never agree to an interview. Maybe not with you, Luke said. But he seems to be rather fond of your sister. A smile spread across Elizabeth's face. Yes, he is, isn't he? The only catch is that Pembroke is still out at Pembroke Manor in the country, Luke reminded her. You'll have to come up with an excuse for going there. Elizabeth shrugged. The mink coat story worked for getting into Pembroke Green today. I'll tell him I have a few more questions about the incident for a follow-up article. That may sound a little lame, as you Americans say, Luke said. A restaurant coat checker swapping a chinchilla for a mink is not exactly the fall of the Berlin Wall. He might not believe you're writing another article on it. Do you think you can pull it off? I'm sure I couldn't, Elizabeth said. But Jessica can. I'll pour on the Jessica charm that's broken the hearts of 100 teenage boys. He'll talk. Late that night, Eliana leaned back into a comfortable old leather chair in the library at his and smiled at Elizabeth. Mrs. Bates looked a bit disappointed when David and I squeaked through the door at the same time as you about 2 seconds before curfew. Elizabeth laughed. I suppose our dorm mother was looking forward to locking the three of us out of the house for the night, as soon as the clock struck 11. She certainly loves throwing the rule book at people. She'll still have a chance to exercise her pitching arm tonight, Eliana said, checking her watch. It's now 11:30, a half hour past curfew. And your twin is still out with Robert. Aren't they a little late for just having dinner at his house? Maybe Robert took her somewhere afterward, probably to make up for his mother curdling the food with those wicked stares of hers. You know, Eliana, I'm sure I've ruined Jessica's chances with Robert's mother. I did a rotten job of interviewing her this morning, but it's not all my fault. Lady Pembroke seems like a totally disagreeable person. Eliana wrinkled her nose. She would not be my first choice for a dinner companion, she admitted. But I wonder if Mrs. Bates will make good on her threat to lock Jessica out for being late. No way, Elizabeth said, shaking her head. You know her weakness for the upper class. She's always willing to look the other way if Jessica is out with little Lord Pembroke. Not like you and me who are dating commoners. Eliana laughed. The only thing I'm looking forward to about ending my charade is the look on Mrs. Bates's face when she discovers the truth that working class Lena from Liverpool is really Princess Eliana, the Queen's daughter from Buckingham Palace. What about when David finds out the truth? Eliana looked at the floor. I don't even want to think about it, she said, evenly squashing down the feeling of panic that rose within her every time she thought about it. Things are going so well for us, Elizabeth. I've never had a beau like David. Most of the boys I date are more interested in having people see us together than in getting to know me. How terrible, Elizabeth said. I never thought about it that way. Thor's appearances aren't important to David. No, they're not. David likes me for myself. And he cares about things that are really important. For instance, he has no classes tomorrow, so he's coming with me to work to help out in the soup kitchen. That's wonderful, Elizabeth said. You both deserve to be happy. So do you, Liz. But you seem so preoccupied lately. I suppose it's all this business with the murders. You don't still believe Robert or someone in his family is a killer, do you? I don't know what to believe. Elizabeth sighed, nervously gripping a silver pendant that hung on a chain around her neck. Eliana wondered if Elizabeth had deeper fears about the murders, fears she was keeping secret. I know Lord Pembroke is related to you, Elizabeth continued, but I also know he has arranged for the police department to help him hide the truth. Suspect that Pembroke knows who the Werewolf murderer is if he's not guilty himself. Eliana gasped. Surely you don't think Lord Pembroke is a crazed killer? No, somehow I don't, Elizabeth said. He doesn't seem like the type. But I'm determined to find out for sure. I have to learn the true identity of the murderer. Will you help me? Eliana squirmed uncomfortably. I don't know, Elizabeth. As I said, the Pembrokes are my cousins. Oh, I'm not asking you to dig up any dirt on them, Elizabeth assured her. I plan to travel to Pembroke Manor tomorrow, disguised as Jessica, to see if I can get some information about the newspaper cover-up. I want to know what Pembroke is hiding under all those stories. I guess you saw the latest Fantasy, in today's paper did missing princess elope with palace guard? Eliana burst into laughter, but quickly stopped when she saw the frown on Elizabeth's face. But Liz, what if Lord Pembroke mentions to Robert that Jessica came to see him, and Robert mentions it to Jess? Elizabeth shrugged. It's worth the risk. When I find absolute proof that something is criminally wrong at Pembroke Manor, Jessica will have to forgive me, and I intend to find proof. So what do you need from me? An alibi, Elizabeth said. I'll tell Pembroke I'm working on another article about his wife's mink. But what can I tell the people at his and the newspaper? Make up another article to work on, Eliana suggested. There must be something of interest to report on in the vicinity of Pembroke Manor. Then all you'll need is a last-minute excuse for staying in the country overnight. Can help you by running interference here at the dorm, especially with Mrs. Bates. Elizabeth clapped her hands together. Ostriches. As you Americans say, come again? From the train window on my way back to London, I noticed a field with ostriches in it. I've heard there's quite a market for them in some parts of the world, the hide, the eggs, and even the meat. I'll ask Tony if I can interview the farmer who's raising them. Not bad. It's weird enough to catch an editor's interest, but minor enough so that he won't send a more senior reporter. I think you've got yourself an assignment. Elizabeth let out a long, sad sigh. What's wrong? Nothing. I just wish I could cover a real story, something more important than ostriches, mink coat swaps, or exploding eggplants. I mean, aubergines. Something like serial killer arrested? Yes, Elizabeth said with a sudden gleam in her blue-green eyes. Something exactly like that. A shaft of morning sunlight pushed through a crack in the heavy velvet curtains early Tuesday, intensifying the murky shadows and bright patches of light in the library of Pembroke Manor. In the shadows in one corner of the room, the elder Lord Robert Pembroke sat at his heavy mahogany desk. He sighed heavily, absent-mindedly stroking a cigarette case that gleamed silver in his hand. The grandfather clock in the parlor told 7 sonorous times. Pembroke exhaled loudly. 7 o'clock in the bloody morning, he said in a slow whisper that was almost a moan. It was a full hour before his usual time for rising, but he had been awake since 4, watching the light of dawn infiltrate the darkroom. Usually Pembroke slept easily, the sleep of a man who is secure in his wealthy, powerful, eminently stable existence. But that morning he realized he had hardly slept in 3 days, not since Saturday's dreadful awakening, when one of the American girls had discovered the body of Thatcher's lovely fiancé. The young lady's death was a horrible tragedy. Poor Thatcher had been a mere shell of himself since Saturday morning. Pembroke empathized completely with his friend, the chief of police. Pembroke had also lost the love of his life, a beautiful young woman with startlingly clear blue eyes and a lilting laugh. But that was long ago. He had moved on in his life, and Thatcher would as well. We only have to hold out a little longer, he had told Thatcher on Saturday. Pembroke sighed at the memory. On Saturday, he had still harbored hope. Those hopes had begun a month earlier, at the murder scene of that unfortunate nurse back in London. By chance, Pembroke had accompanied Thatcher to lunch that day, and so was present when the chief of police inspected the murder scene. The evidence had confused Thatcher, gash in the throat, as if the woman had been mauled by a beast. But Pembroke understood immediately. Werewolves were his lifelong passion. He had spent hours poring over dusty volumes and faded court proceedings from medieval werewolf trials. He had recognized the signs instantly. Nurse Dolores Handley had been murdered by a werewolf. A real werewolf. Pembroke had dreamed all his life of studying one in person, as it were, and learning all there was to know about it. Besides, an authentic werewolf for Pembroke's trophy collection would have been the culmination of a lifetime of exotic game hunting and the crown on his years of study of werewolf lore. It would have brought him fame and fortune, not only in his native England but around the world. Sales of the journal would skyrocket with the articles he'd print, and the name of Robert Pembroke, Sr. would be on the lips of every journalist and every enthusiast of the hunt on every continent of the globe. It would be a far cry from the last time the Pembroke name had been the subject of major news stories. Almost 20 years earlier, Pembroke had begged Thatcher to help him suppress the evidence of the nurse's Murder to keep every fortune hunter in Europe from converging on the city. He didn't want his private werewolf hunt to escalate into a contest for amateurs. Then came the murder of Dr. Cameron Neville. Pembroke had been deeply distressed to see the body of his oldest and dearest friend, sprawled on the carpeting of the doctor's Essex Street residence. Certainly the torn clothing, the bits of fur scattered about the murder scene, and the telltale wound in Neville's neck had sickened Pembroke, but they had also reinforced his original theory. A werewolf was on the prowl in London. As he stood over the doctor's body, Pembroke had resolved once again to find the murderous beast. The slaying of his friend had turned his werewolf hunt into a personal mission. At that point he had known for sure that he would prevail in the end. Werewolves were notoriously messy about their business of killing. All Pembroke had to do was follow the clues, anticipate the beast's next actions, and watch and wait. But it was at the scene of Neville's murder that Pembroke's fears had started. As he turned away from the body, he had noticed the silver cigarette case, gleaming like moonlight on the floor. When he recognized the distinctive silver case, Pembroke felt as if his own heart had been torn out. Finally, he had some evidence of who the werewolf could be, but the evidence pointed in a direction he did not want to investigate. Nothing could make him believe that the cigarette case's owner was a murderer, much less a werewolf. The case could have been stolen, he had told himself. Perhaps its owner had visited Neville before the murder, despite testimony from Neville's housekeeper that the doctor had entertained no visitors. Then on Saturday Joy Singleton was found dead. Pembroke still didn't believe what the cigarette case seemed to reveal about the identity of the werewolf. But he knew that others would believe it, especially after he found fragments of a fabric he recognized stuck in the door frame of the room where the werewolf had struck. The evidence was overwhelming. Suddenly, hiding the details of the mysterious deaths was no longer a matter of adding a new trophy to his collection. A cover-up was vital to protecting his family. The last scandal had made him the subject of derision throughout London. He had spent more than a decade rebuilding his reputation. He wasn't going to lose that reputation now. Even more important was protecting the person who would be implicated by the evidence, the owner of the silver case. Suddenly, a finger of shimmering sunlight jabbed through the curtains of the still dark library. It seized the cigarette case Pembroke still turned in his hand, staining its surface a deep crimson. Pembroke dropped the case as if it were on fire, the cigarette case that belonged to his son Robert. The grandfather clock in the parlor had just chimed 9 o'clock when the phone rang on Pembroke's desk, startling him out of a fitful doze. Other newspaper executives insulated themselves behind armies of secretaries. Pembroke prided himself on being accessible. The journal's editors knew they could ring him up directly in his library at Pembroke Manor. He opened his mouth to yell at Editor Reeves about the latest ridiculous story concerning the Princess Eliana, eloped with a palace guard. Indeed, of course, Pembroke had told the editors to play up the princess story to deflect attention from the recent deaths, but the sight of that sort of fiction in his newspaper made him positively ill. "Hello, Lord Pembroke," exclaimed a breathless, youthful voice at the other end of the line. For the first time in days, a genuine smile sprang to Pembroke's face. The caller could be no one but Robert's young lady friend, Jessica Wakefield. "I have a few itsy-bitsy questions for you about that mink coat of Lady Pembroke's for a follow-up article in the newspaper, of course," Jessica said brightly. "Would you mind if I dropped by Pembroke Manor this afternoon to talk to you about it?" Pembroke chuckled to himself, flattered. The girl was charmingly transparent. The mink swap was hardly worth one newspaper article, let alone two. Obviously, the pretty young intern was paying special attention to it because it involved him. After all, along with being the owner of the newspaper she worked at, he was her beau's father. Eager to be in his good graces, she erroneously assumed that he cared about his petty wife and her blasted mink. In addition, the girl was probably eager for an excuse to revisit Pembroke Manor. He remembered the way Jessica's eyes had gobbled up its luxurious furnishings like the eyes of a penniless child in a sweet shop. "I wouldn't mind at all, child," he told her. "Glad to have you any time. In fact, you should plan to stay for supper and to spend the night as well. We've plenty of room, and Lord knows we could use some cheer around here." Then his eyes narrowed as suspicions rose in his mind. "You will be alone, won't you, dear?" he asked. That is to say, you don't plan to bring that twin sister of yours, do you? Oh no, Jessica assured him. I'm working on this story all by myself. Thank goodness, he thought, as Jessica chatted on about her internship. It was remarkable that a guileless girl like Jessica could have an identical twin who was so nosy and suspicious. Pembroke thought Elizabeth was the Wakefield he had to watch out for. She spent entirely too much time peering into dark corners with those big blue-green eyes, and scribbling endlessly in that little notebook of hers. It was no wonder she had hooked up with young Mr. Shepherd. Pembroke's lips tightened into a thin, hard line at the thought of the boy. The young poet made him unspeakably uncomfortable. Every time he looked at Luke, he felt battered by the accusations in the boy's brilliant blue eyes. Elizabeth's choice of Luke as a companion made her doubly suspect. In Pembroke's book, Lord Pembroke? Jessica asked uncertainly. I'm sorry, dear, he said, grateful that he was speaking to charming Jessica, rather than her nosy sister. What were you saying? I just asked if Lady Pembroke has said anything about me to you. I'm afraid he was a little too assertive when I interviewed her yesterday. She may be a bit upset with me. Don't worry yourself, he assured her. Lady Pembroke hasn't breathed a word to me. He didn't mention the fact that he and his wife had barely spoken to each other in 17 years to be exact. And I'm sure you acted quite properly, he added. A good reporter must be aggressive. But don't tell your sister I said that. An uncharacteristic wave of sentiment swept over Pembroke, sparked by the girl's cheerful innocence and her fondness for his unfortunate son. Miss Wakefield, no, Jessica, he began. I owe you a debt of gratitude, my dear. And a Pembroke always pays his debts. I don't understand. No, of course she wouldn't. The changes she had wrought in Robert had come about naturally, just from being near her sweet influence. Jessica, you must realize that you're very different from other young ladies Robert has courted in the past. You wouldn't like them pretentious, stuffy, empty-headed lot. What I'm trying to say is that Robert has been quite a handful to discipline at times. He's never been a bad youth, just rambunctious, untamed. But since he's been courting you, I've noticed a change. My son has more direction than he did even a short while ago. He's more responsible. And I'm certain that he's happier than he's ever been. Oh, all of that to you. The girl seemed at a loss for words. Jessica, Pembroke concluded soberly, I want you to know that Robert loves you very much. Please remember that no matter what happens. Elizabeth paid the taxi driver and began walking up the long driveway to Pembroke Manor through a misty rain. Convincing Tony to let her cover the ostrich story had been easy. Eliana was right. Ostriches were weird enough to catch his interest, but minor enough so that he didn't want to send a more senior reporter. Of course, Jessica had glowered at both of them as Tony told Elizabeth to go ahead with it. Jessica had been aching for a chance to return to Pembroke Manor. She must have realized that this story would put Elizabeth right in the neighborhood. Elizabeth felt bad about sticking her sister with today's bumpo cases, but she knew that her investigation was more important than Jessica's jealousy. Elizabeth sighed, thinking of what Lord Pembroke had said on the phone that morning. He had sounded so different from his usual overbearing self. He had been vulnerable, grateful, even. In other words, he had sounded like a normal, concerned father. And he thought Jessica was helping his son. For a moment, Elizabeth wondered if she and Luke were wrong about Robert and his family. But she didn't want to have sympathy for the Pembrokes. That could get in the way of her investigation. She forced herself to remember Joy Singleton's body in Jessica's bed, and knew she had to find proof of the murderer's identity, even if it turns out to be the young Robert Pembroke, she thought, remembering his father's words. Especially if it turned out to be Robert. Elizabeth cleared the crest of the hill, and the front of stately Pembroke Manor rose into sight. Elizabeth gasped. Red lights flashed through the rain from an ambulance that waited in front of the mansion's grand entranceway. Uniformed police officers and medical personnel rushed around the ambulance, while servants huddled together on the front portico, watching. Jessica, Lord Pembroke said in a distracted voice as he caught sight of Elizabeth. In all the commotion, I quite forgot you would be arriving. You're welcome to stay, of course. But there's been an unfortunate incident. I'm not certain when I may be able to speak with you. What's happened? Elizabeth asked. Instead of answering, Pembroke placed a hand on her shoulder. Elizabeth was surprised to feel it trembling. Jessica, he said, see that you don't mention today's event to anyone. At the newspaper, including that sister of yours. It is the subject of a police investigation, so any publicity at this time would be inappropriate. He spoke quietly, but his voice held a note of thinly disguised panic. Oh, you can count on me, Elizabeth assured him. But I will stay if you don't mind. Can you tell me what's? Before she finished speaking, Pembroke had turned away satisfied and was hurrying toward Constable Atherton, who was awaiting him near the ambulance. With her arms folded impatiently in front of her, Elizabeth approached the house and skirted the row of parked police cars. As she neared the clustered servants, she saw that most of them were weeping. What in the world is going on? She asked under her breath. And is it related to the deaths of Joy and the others? She quickly decided on a course of action. After she learned what had just happened, she would slip inside the manor house and search for clues about the werewolf's identity and the Pembrokes' part in the murders. 2 servants passed close to where Elizabeth stood behind a hedge. Found murdered this morning, she heard one of them say before the couple moved out of earshot. Who was found murdered? Elizabeth asked herself out loud. A moment later she had her answer. Alistair, the tall, thin butler who had served tea on the morning of Joy's death, was led sobbing out of the house. Behind him, 2 paramedics carried a stretcher bearing what Elizabeth knew was a sheet-covered corpse. The constable lifted the sheet, and Elizabeth gasped. On the stretcher lay the body of the Pembrokes' pretty, brown-haired cook, Maria Finch. Even from a distance, Elizabeth could see on her throat a bright red gash. Chapter 7. Eliana took a dripping saucepan from David on Tuesday afternoon and began rubbing it with her dish towel. Working at the shelter's soup kitchen with you today has been just super. Lena, David said, plunging his hands back into the soapy water. So many people are less fortunate than we are. Nothing can compare to the feeling of knowing you've helped people who are down on their luck. Eliana grinned. As she had told Elizabeth the night before, David was different from any boy she had ever dated. She tried to imagine self-centered Harry Camden, the Prime Minister's nephew, rolling up his cuff-link sleeves to scrub pots in a soup kitchen. The image wouldn't come. I feel the same way about working with the poor, Eliana said, taking a large skillet from him. Someday I'd like to do something for them that's bigger than this, something that would make a real difference in people's lives. David nodded solemnly. The need is there, certainly. I served lunch to a woman with a broken arm, and to a man with cataracts, and to a little boy who couldn't stop coughing. Do these people have any means of receiving free medical services? Not in this neighborhood, Eliana said with a sigh. The nearest clinic is more than a dozen blocks away. I remember an announcement at the opening ceremonies for this shelter that a clinic was being planned as well, but the funding fell through. That's a shame, David said. Eliana felt a warm rush of love at the sincerity in his voice. You know, Lena, if I had a lot of money, I would use it to fund the facilities for proper medical treatment for these people. And then instead of studying literature, I would put myself through medical school so I could administer the treatment myself. Then he looked at her curiously. But Lena, he said, confused, did you just say you were at the opening ceremonies for this shelter? That was several years ago. I thought this was your first visit to London. Eliana chastised herself for the slip. Her mother considered her too young to be the royal family's representative at such events as the ribbon-cutting ceremony at the city's new homeless shelter, though it was one of the few royal duties she would have relished. But in this case she had accompanied her older sister Gloria, who despised such events. Of course she couldn't let David know she had been there. Oh, I wasn't actually there, she said breezily, keeping her eyes on the soup tureen she was drying. One of the managers here told me about the ceremony. Would have been back in Liverpool at the time of it, of course. Ah, Liverpool, David said, looking almost satisfied with her explanation. I used to help out occasionally at a shelter there. Perhaps you know of it. It's not far from the Lime Street station. Oh, I'm certain that I don't know it, Eliana interrupted. My mother is quite overprotective. She would never allow me to work in this sort of place at home. That's one of the reasons I left, really. At least I'm not lying to him about that much. David's handsome face took on a thoughtful expression. It's unfortunate that your mother feels that way, he said. Helping people who are in need is just about the most important thing in the world. That's why I'd like to use my skills someday to treat the illnesses of the poor and the homeless. Eliana looked at him admiringly. The other young people I know who aspire to medical school are planning to specialize in diseases of the rich. What an empty life that would be. Most people think I'm insane, David replied bitterly. They tell me how much more money I could make in a specialty like plastic surgery. He gazed deep into her eyes. But not you, Lena. That's what I love about you. You're so down to earth. Eliana's breath caught at the word love. David hadn't exactly said he loved her, but he had come close. Part of her longed to hear him use those words, and then to repeat them back to him. On the other hand, the very thought of it sent her into a panic. Was she leading David on? Did she have any right to become this close to a boy she knew would hate her when he learned the truth about her? David began to place his hands on her shoulders as though he was about to kiss her on the lips. Then he remembered the soapy dishwater that dripped from his fingers and stopped laughing. He leaned over to kiss her lightly on the forehead, holding his wet hands away from her. We're almost finished here, he said. What do you say we spend the rest of the day sightseeing together? Have you been to the Portobello Road flea market? We ought to make use of the free afternoon. Two working-class blokes from Liverpool don't often get the chance to explore the big city. Elizabeth stood in Robert's room at Pembroke Manor on Tuesday afternoon, feeling guilty about prowling around his bedroom. Maybe I should have just stayed in London, she thought. Elizabeth sighed, impatient with her own indecision. She had been thinking in circles all day ever since the phone call to Lord Pembroke that morning. His gratitude toward Jessica made her feel reluctant sympathy toward the father and son. Maybe she was totally off base suspecting them of murder. But then she remembered the odd way Lord Pembroke had ended their telephone conversation. I want you to know that Robert loves you very much, he had said. Please remember that, no matter what happens. No matter what happens. What does that mean? She asked herself aloud for the 10th time that day. Does it mean that Lord Pembroke is protecting his son? Is young Robert Pembroke a serial murderer and a werewolf? She felt a prickling along her spine and was grateful that Jessica was not planning to see Robert that day. And after today I might have enough evidence to keep her from seeing him ever again. The scene that had taken place in front of the mansion a half hour earlier played back in Elizabeth's mind. Most of all, she remembered the sight of Alistair's slender shoulders shaking with anguished sobs as Maria's body was brought out of the house. The recollection of the cook's body helped Elizabeth steel herself for prying into Robert's belongings. She had to know beyond any doubt if he had killed Maria and the other victims. As Elizabeth prepared to search the room for clues, the question she had tried to banish from her mind suddenly shoved its way to the forefront. Was Maria dead because of Elizabeth's investigation? Had somebody discovered that the servants had spoken to her? Perhaps the werewolf had seen Maria at the end of the upstairs corridor, just after the murder. Or perhaps Robert or whoever the murderer was, had been outside the kitchen door, listening to every word of Elizabeth's interrogation of the servants. Was it her fault that Maria was dead? She shook her head. I won't think about that right now, she whispered. The most important thing now is to prove who the murderer is. If it's Robert Pembroke, something in this room ought to tell me that. She started poking around Robert's spacious bedroom, unsure of exactly what she was searching for. But when she opened the door to the enormous walk-in closet, Elizabeth gasped. She finally had her proof. Hanging inside the closet door was a paisley-patterned silk bathrobe, in hunter green with a small tear on one shoulder. With trembling hands, Elizabeth removed the envelope from her backpack and pulled out the thread she had taken from the doorway at the murder scene. The bathrobe was a perfect match. Robert Pembroke had been in the room where Joy Singleton was murdered. Elizabeth jumped at the sound of approaching footsteps. She shoved Robert's bathrobe into her backpack to study later, and ran out into the hallway. Seconds before a white-haired chambermaid appeared. May I help you? The maid asked in a distracted voice. Elizabeth saw tear stains on her face, and knew she was grieving for the murdered cook. It's Miss Jessica Wakefield, isn't it? That's right, Elizabeth said, trying to control her excited breathing. She smiled tentatively, showing the dimple in her left cheek. I'm afraid I'm lost. In this big house, she said solemnly. Can you direct me to, the library? The library was the first thing that popped into Elizabeth's head, and she wanted to kick herself as soon as she said it. Nobody who knew Jessica would believe she was searching for a library. Elizabeth let out a sigh of relief as the maid gave her directions. Of course, nobody here knows Jessica well enough to be suspicious of a statement like that. When Elizabeth pushed open the double doors to the library, she gazed admiringly at the huge, well-stocked room. She closed the doors behind her carefully and began wandering around the ceiling-high shelves, reading the titles. As always, Elizabeth was fascinated by books. Like every room at Pembroke Manor, the Pembroke Library was richly decorated. In a style Elizabeth thought of as very English, this room had a masculine look, with a big mahogany desk in one corner and accents of burgundy leather everywhere. Grouped on the desk and arranged on one wall was a collection of formal family portraits in gilt-edged wood frames. She stood for a moment in front of the wall of portraits. The largest was a studio photograph of Robert, standing in the full riding attire that Jessica had described from her first meeting with him. He looked just as he always did. To Elizabeth, handsome, smug, and self-important. But the books were what held Elizabeth's attention. She pulled out a copy of Wuthering Heights, a first edition, she was sure, and lovingly fingered its well-dusted leather spine. Then she pushed it back onto the shelf, forcing herself to remember her mission. She began looking for clues. When she saw Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Elizabeth forgot her resolve once more. She had started to read the book last week at his and hadn't had a chance to get back to it since. Well, Pembroke had told her to make herself at home. Perhaps he wouldn't mind if she borrowed it for the evening to read in bed. She reached up and began to pull the book from the shelf. Elizabeth heard a loud click. She whirled guiltily, and her eyes widened with astonishment. A leather-covered panel in the wall had sprung open. Pulling out the volume had triggered a secret door. Even the walls here aren't what they seem, she whispered breathlessly. Then Elizabeth pushed open the secret door and walked slowly into the small, dark room. Jessica sighed dramatically. But what's wrong with my sentence? She asked, jabbing at Tuesday's Bumpo story on her computer screen. It says the man who was arrested stole a single shoe from each of 17 women. What right do you have to make me change it? Don't be angry at me, Luke said. You know Tony asked me to help you with your article in Elizabeth's absence. Actually, I think you've done a fine job, except that you can't say the man stole the shoes because you don't know that for sure. Yes, I do, Jessica said. I heard him tell Sergeant Bumpo he likes clogs the best with platform heels. Face it, the guy is Looney Tunes. Even Sergeant Bumpo says he's definitely the thief. He probably is, Luke conceded. Nonetheless, you can't say so in the newspaper before he's been convicted of the crime. Until then, you have to say he's suspected of stealing the shoes. Jessica sighed again. Life wasn't fair. She should be out in the country, covering a story within dropping-in distance of Pembroke Manor. And Elizabeth should be sitting here listening to Luke tell her what's wrong with her article. Of course, she admitted to herself, if Elizabeth had written it, there probably wouldn't be anything wrong with it. Jessica knew that writing wasn't her greatest talent. Still, it was humiliating to be told she needed a tutor. Besides, she was still mad at Elizabeth for hating Robert, so by extension, she was mad at her sister's boyfriend too. Jessica's only consolation was the knowledge that Elizabeth would get stuck with the Bumpo stories tomorrow, while Jessica and Robert drove out to Stonehenge alone in his silver convertible. She'd like to see the look on Elizabeth's face tomorrow, when she realized Jessica wasn't going to accompany her to the newspaper. She hoped Bumpo would dig up something particularly trivial and ridiculous to be reported on in Wednesday's journal. I trust Robert has been showing you some of the high points of our fair country, Luke said after Jessica had sent the computer file to be printed. Jessica was surprised by his amiable tone. Yes, she boasted. As a matter of fact, we're driving into the countryside tomorrow to visit Stonehenge, just the two of us alone in the country. You seem to have become very close to Robert in a short time, Luke said. Jessica smiled, thinking of Robert. Yes, I have, she answered happily. I Haven't felt this way about anyone in a long time. Consider me officially in love. And does Robert return your feelings? Luke asked, looking at her intently. Jessica nodded. Of course he does. Then she wrinkled her forehead. Elizabeth didn't ask you to give me a big brotherly talk about why I shouldn't love Robert, did she? Luke laughed, but his eyes looked troubled. He absent-mindedly pulled a silver keychain from his pocket and began drumming it on the desk. No, though I have to admit that the Pembrokes are not my favorite family. Jessica bristled. Don't be upset, Jessica. I promise not to get big brotherly. Jessica stared at him for a moment, until she was satisfied that he was telling the truth. Then she noticed his keychain and pointed to it. Hey, that looks just like that weird necklace you gave Elizabeth. Do you really believe that werewolf stuff? Or are you just putting my sister on? Luke laughed, then said, I've been studying werewolves for a long time. Jessica, my mother was sort of an enthusiast. She got me interested when I was a small child. And after all these years of study, I've reached the conclusion that werewolves really do exist. He gazed at her intently, and even Jessica had to admit that his startlingly blue eyes had a sexy, almost hypnotic quality. Then Luke recited in a solemn voice. Through darkened wood he runs alone. White teeth gleam like sharpened bone. Wolfsbane bloom is softly kissed. By moonlight drifting through the mist. By day he wishes no one ill. At night he hungers for the kill. Jessica felt a shiver run down her spine, as if she ought to be looking over her shoulder. Did you write that? Luke smiled, looking perfectly normal again. Well, yes, he admitted. But I'm still working on it, really. Do you like it? Jessica hesitated, uncertain. It's kind of spooky. Good. It's supposed to be. Suddenly Jessica thought she knew what Luke was up to. She shook her finger at him. I get it. You're trying to scare my sister so you can play the big, strong boyfriend. Well, you don't have to worry about me. I won't tell her your secret. I'm not even speaking to her.
No, Jessica.
It's not like that. I don't know why Elizabeth is such a wimp all of a sudden, Jessica continued, but I don't scare so easily. You poets are too weird. I'm just glad I'm dating a normal